You fixing your mortgage? Do you feel the pressure to do it because you're on a standard variable rate, because your bargain rate from the era of hyper low interest rates has come to an end? Because suddenly your mortgage has gone from maybe a few £100 a month to £1,000 or even more a month, and you can't afford it. And you've got all sorts of other essentials like shopping and paying for your kids' knickknacks and everything else. Life is tough, isn't it? They're calling it the cost of living crisis. I don't like to call it that because people will continue talking about the cost of living crisis when the cost of living crisis is over. And I'm just wondering whether it might be this year, because the international pressure on interest rates is downward. And when it goes downward, we live in a better world because there's more money for you and I. Not great news for savers, although savers have had a better time over the last year, or at least since Liz Truss got booted as Prime Minister, because she might be the cause of this high interest rate shock. The Bank of England are looking at the interest rates and thinking, well, we're going to keep them the same. Some are even singing the blues and saying they should be risen further, but I think they're coming down. The international market rate is going down, and there is a price war going on. So you can easily get a fix on your mortgage of below 5%. Some are even looking at 4.8% now, and there might be a bit of a war going on, because actually the incentive for the banks and the building societies to fix now over the next 5 years is that they'll make even more profit over the next 2 or 3 years because rates are going down. Now, I've got to tell you something, which is that I fixed my mortgage as soon as the relationship between the standard variable rate, which is like at 6% or something, went down to under 5%. And for me, that saves me one a hell of a lot of money. And I know where I stand. I also know that if I'd been patient a little bit longer, it would have gone down further, but then I'd still be spending so much more on my mortgage every month. I needed my bread and buttered now rather than in the future. Did I make the right decision? Let's go and find out from Justin Urquhart-Stewart, economist and chairman of the Regionally Investment Platform. Hello, Justin.
Hi, Johnny. Good to speak to you.
Always good to see you, and great to see the old trouser keeper uppers as normal. It wouldn't be a Justin interview without those.
Trousers are a good thing to have, and if you keep them up, so much the better.
Absolutely, Justin.
Because the Americans call them suspenders, which is doesn't really translate very well over
No,
here.
well, listen, you keep it calling, and we're enjoying the cut of your jib. Now, the NatWest chairman. Let's talk about his gaffe.
Oh.
Right, and he's been described as out of touch here because the chairman says Sir Howard Davies, a city grandee, but for how much longer? And he earned £750 million and then some last year, said the changes in the mortgage system after the global financial crisis meant new buyers were rightly forced to save for longer to raise a deposit. I don't think it's that difficult at the moment. You have to save, and that's the way it always used to be. And I'm thinking to myself, God, I mean, I'm here on the shop floor. You know, you used to be able, I don't know, 20 years ago, you were able to borrow just silly rates, 105%.
Yeah.
On your house, and now the loan to value in London is like 40%. You can't get any more mortgage than that, and 60% elsewhere in the country. So, I mean, for your average person on like a minimum wage or doing a little bit better than that, trying to find 30 grand, it's just a non-starter.
No, I mean, just for getting people to just get the deposit right, it's going to be really very difficult. And also in terms of if you are renewing your mortgage, actually finding out if you actually qualify still, because actually it turns out if your prices haven't been going up as much as before, or you need to borrow more, and they do that calculation on your income. And so there you are, find yourself stuck because there's nothing else you can try and do. But be positive about this. There is some good news going around, which is actually what you were talking about just now. By what you did, you actually fixed after you saw some of the rates dropping down. And now, I suspect they will drop down further still, but at least what you've done now, you've now got a fixed amount which you can budget for, and rather than necessarily waiting with your fingers crossed, hoping it may or may not go down a bit more. So that was the right decision to make, because now at least you can actually control the amount you've got for how long that's going to be. The problem for another million people or so next year, they're coming off those very low rates you were talking about, and we had those low rates because of the banking crisis. They were emergency rates. Now, what the Bank of England should have done is got us off emergency rates much, much earlier, so that people sitting there realising that 1.5% to 2% is that normal. No, it's not. Get rates up to where they probably should be for the longer term, and that way people won't be so terrified when they suddenly see your now mortgage costs will be more than doubling. If you had 1.5% and suddenly it's going to come back in at 4.5%, that's very painful. But again, some good news here: the banks don't want you to be bad news, because otherwise their name is plastered all over the papers again.
Yeah.
So you must speak to them and say to them, right, what can we try and do? I can afford this. Can I extend my mortgage for longer? Can I actually make sure I adjust the payment levels? Or will you offer me a fixed alternative? Because it's not in their interest to actually just have you go bust effectively with it. So don't ignore it. It's not one of those things you hide under the pillow, ignore it. It will still be lurking behind you. So deal with it now. But better news, those rates coming down. Inflation is still there, but it's lower inflation. It's disinflation. So it's still going up, but at a lower rate. The Bank of England was putting rates up ostensibly to try and stop inflation. Well, that's a bit of an odd argument, that one, because most of that inflation wasn't caused by you and I having a consumer boom. It was actually caused primarily by the likes of Russia with Ukraine and the war there, the oil price going up, and the supply chain, as you saw with only a couple of years ago, with that socking great container vessel stuck in the Suez Canal. Now, you've got another one of problems there. Now, it's not stuck in the Suez Canal. The container ships can't get to the Suez Canal because of the Houthi rebels. And that's going to add more to cost, more inflation coming through. So,
and they're saying, aren't they, sorry, carry on, please.
Oh, no,
you're coming to the nub of it.
Yeah. Because it's when you get to the stage now, if those rates aren't going to go down anytime soon, the Bank of England will be very cautious in doing so. At least you've locked in at a price. Now, what the chairman of NatWest was saying rather badly yesterday, not that it's easier for us. No, it's not. It's still going to be incredibly difficult. There's more choice of mortgages, and some of the cost of those mortgages have come down. It's not as it was 4 or 5 years ago, but it's a little bit easier to shop around and try and get yourself a broker to see if you can get a good deal on it, and look at the variation of terms you can have. Look at the times in terms of do you extend it? Do you actually make it more of a family mortgage across the generations? So remember, the family's worth more than the individual. Look after your grandparents. Remember, like them all, but they've got some value. And in many ways, almost look at the old 3-tier family again. How does the family afford to actually have their housing in the future? Because for individuals doing it, particularly in hot areas like London, it's very, very difficult and very expensive. So you own a flat, it's just you can't afford to eat.
Yeah, well, the average house price for first-time buyers, and we're not talking about London here, we're talking about the country, £218,500 last year. You won't get much for your pound in London there, according to Nationwide, roughly 5 times the average salary. That's up 2.7 times in 1983. Savers also have to put money aside for an average of 13 years to save for a 20% deposit. And separate data published by Halifax showed that house prices actually rose 1.1% in December, the third consecutive month as lower mortgage rates revived the property market. I'm not going to use the B word, the boom word here, Justin, but we are going to see a recovery in 2024 of the property market. And I guess for tenants, a bit more peace between landlords who've really properly copped it with 14 consecutive interest rate rises on their, commercial mortgages, putting terrible pressure on them, and then forcing rent rises, and some of them losing their way in the market, not just because they can't afford to keep it anymore because the rents are lower than the mortgage they're paying, but also the increased regulation, making sure your gas fittings are good, making sure you're lecky and you're... and it's just more difficult for landlords, isn't it?
It is, and that's why you've seen an awful lot of people coming out of the buy-to-let market. Because in the buy-to-let market, you didn't make much money on the rent. Well, obviously from tenants' point of view, they probably think they did, because the cost of it and the real benefits were the old tax breaks. So you could actually offset your interest against the amount you were paying, so against the costs. And so that was actually worthwhile. So a lot of buy-to-let, the landlords are pulling out of that market. And so that means that may be finding more difficulty there. But what people should now be looking at, though, is trying to get down to those areas where they can see property prices will be rising. Did you say it's not going to be a boom? And that gives our economy that one vital word, confidence. Because if your primary asset is worth something and going up in price, there's always a good example when you actually look over in America, exactly the same as us. 65 to 70% of their economy is based on the consumer. Mr. and Mrs. Joe Schmo living in Little Rock, Arkansas, shopping in Walmart. And if they're upset because the value of their property has gone down, you're precisely how quickly that affects the American economy, affects the global economy really very quickly. So get those consumers just having a little bit of confidence. It doesn't mean there's going to be a boom, but it means that they'll be, if they've got a job, they'll carry on spending. Wage rises have been going up. Interest rates look as though they peaked for the moment. But as I say, with this, you can't guess where this is going at the moment. There are too many other uncertainties, which is why you were quite right to actually bag yourself a certainty and say it's more expensive, but at least I know what I'm going to be paying for the next 3, 4, 5 years, whatever it happens to be.
I have an Urquhart-Stewart kite mark with my decision, which is quite a relief. Schroders, that world-famous bank, has calculated that house prices are at their most expensive relative to earnings since not 2006, not 1976, not 1926, but 1876, which is when those steam trains were invented and created. So the rental market is a disaster in parallel.
Well, I mean, obviously, it goes back to the original problem that William the Conqueror had coming over here as a Frenchman to try and get himself a mortgage in Britain. Found it very difficult. But, you know, the issue is, of course, what we've had is more demanding for housing, and there isn't enough housing around. This is the argument between the politicians been going on for donkey's years. And as you were talking quite rightly with Jim Dale, building the right houses in the right way to make sure that they are flood-proof, or they are on stilts or something like that. That's quite normal in other parts of the world. It doesn't really have that dramatic for us. So we know how unsafe some of these areas are. So build and adjust accordingly for it. That way you can get more building going in and get people to think about property as not a short-term punt. It's a long-term investment for the family. Start planning your finances from grandparents right the way down to grandchildren, pooling your assets, pooling your debt to a great extent. Because if I was going out as a youngster trying to get a mortgage now, for all the reasons you said in terms of more deposits, it's going to be very difficult to qualify for all these different rules, even though there is more competition. If I'm doing that as a member of the family, and actually the people with greater assets who are behind them, then that's a better deal for the lenders, and so they'll actually be delighted to have you in there, because as far as they're concerned, they don't want to see any clients in trouble, because they end up on the front page of the papers actually then being told they're greedy bankers, as opposed to, well, what they normally get called, which is probably greedy bankers.
Indeed, indeed. Beautiful poetry there from Justin. So the thing about, you know, what Jim said, and obviously this is where your two worlds come together, banking and ecology and the weather, obviously mortgage rates and actually applying for a mortgage depends on things like, do you live on a floodplain? Do you have Japanese knotweed in your walls and all this kind of thing? And what about that window? It's cracked and made of UPVC. Knock £500 off the asking price right now and all that kind of thing. The problem with building in towns where there perhaps is a floodplain and a hilltop is that you take away the traditional shape of that town. So that, you know, if you're forced not to build on what used to be a floodplain and might still be one if it gets particularly wet, and then building in a place which is verging on the green belt, and we'd rather not have a housing estate overlooking that beautiful set of trees and mountains, is a town which starts to build differently and in a sort of ugly way, which will create inflation in better areas because of a less of a scarcity, and ugly, sort of quickly built houses. You know, some of the architecture is a little bit samey. So should we not be a bit clever? Should councils actually incentivise to build in town centres where the retail environment is declining? You often see horrid houses down in, you know, sort of old Victorian jobs which have seen better years. Shouldn't we be a bit clever, get investors to be incentivised to refurbish and rebuild homes inside towns that are near your town centre high street?
And this is where you can, the government can do something really very sensible here.
Right.
And actually then start encouraging and giving more power to councils to actually do that sort of planning and design work, not wait for planning committees from government to try and do anything. That's why we have such trouble in getting anything done. So what I've seen in West London now, they were quite deliberately getting properties, building flats, so it encouraged more people to living in the town, and therefore there were more facilities and things available. The mistake they made where I live is they actually said, yes, come and buy a flat for you to live in. Unfortunately, everybody who bought the flats comes from the Far East. Nice people, but they ain't going to live there. So therefore, they're not contributing to the retail market at all. So if you actually say, look, local houses, which for people who are actually going to be living here, or flats and such like, you can get that income being attracted into that area much more. There's a lot of that awful phrase, brownfield sites, but basically that's just derelict areas, poor quality buildings. And so you attract that. Now, how do you do that? And the answer is you can actually create things like regional bonds. Actually, so as we used to have years back, is that you could buy bonds for Kingston upon Hull, something like that. And Mrs. Thatcher actually got rid of a lot of those, so they got out of control. But for local infrastructure, local building, you could actually then get people a reward for supporting your local investments. They get a tax break on it as well, and the town or city is actually benefiting from that. That's a positive thing to try and do. And what's more, it doesn't cost the government anything at all. What it's doing up is actually allowing more money to be invested in a directed local manner.
So this is the point of it, that we are living in this different environment, very sudden changes both to the way that a town can look, so many different metrics. Justin, taking into account every single metric that you have discussed here, let's take a town of 300,000 in population. How will that town look when you take into account mortgage rates, inflation, wages, floodplains, weather changes? Will your town and city look quite profoundly different in 20 years' time to how it looks now? Is the city centre going to be the place to build, or are you going to see lots of greenfield, out-of-town petrol stations and Asdas blocking your view of the mountaintops?
Now, you're going to be seeing a change in the towns, quite right too.
Yeah.
Remember, we have this lovely idea that High Street goes back to Tudor times. No, it doesn't. High Street goes back, frankly, to the beginning of the 20th century. And so get away from that and actually think what you want to have in that town. And the answer is you're going to have different style of retail outlets. More people are now shopping online and they get deliveries to their house. So therefore, do you need to have all those shops there for people to go into? The answer is no, you don't. That's something that's not going to get reversed. You know, we're I'm very lazy, so I'm very happy to the likes of Amazon and others to do the hard work for me, known as walking, and because I'm bone idle. So therefore, the town actually realises that it attracts people into the centre for other reasons, leisure, entertainment, going out in the evening, and it becomes more social. Your transport becomes easier because you're all living in a closer area. You are then also attracting, because there are people there spending money, more people coming in, you're going to attract more investment. Companies will want to actually try and set up their benefit from that as well. And we've got some really good hotspots around the country. You only have to look at, say, some of the technology hubs, often around the universities, and you've heard the nickname of them, of Silicon Glen, Silicon Fen, Silicon, what's it, Gorge? That's Bristol. Silicon Implant, no, that's something different. And so all those different areas have little... Sorry about that. What you find is local high-tech businesses forming around those tech areas, and they breed. And we're very good at this. We start more small businesses in this country than France and Germany put together. Yeah. But we're really bad at financing them for longer term. So the Americans come along and say, great technology, love that. By the way, could we put it in Silicon Valley? And so, again, with this proper longer-term design from governments, doesn't matter which colour they are, actually making sure there are proper incentives, not actually giving people back the tax breaks, but incentive to invest, both corporate and individuals, and you'll put a different aspect on what's happening to those towns. It'll have more money coming through them, and back that word again, more confidence coming through. Get that, and okay, we've got bad weather, it's got rain, it's cold, but if financially you're feeling a little bit more secure with you, the family, and in your area, that'll make a big difference, despite the fact the floods are going to be, and the freezing time period is going to be awful. We can, in the medium term, design to make sure we manage all of that. It's not difficult. And you have to look at places like Holland, where they've been used to dealing with the polders and being able to how they control their dampness there. And as you quite rightly said, it was the Dutch who drained not just the fens, but also down in Somerset as well, the levels.
That's
and
right.
only when they stopped doing those and started filling in some of the drains, and lo and behold, what happened? We got the floods again.